Let's look at a really light and nimble medieval arming sword. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now this is the Darksword Armory Squire sword, and it is a relatively small but incredibly nimble arming sword. Now this is going to be a review of this sword, but it's also going to be a general statement about medieval arming swords as well. Now first up, this is from Darksword Armory. It is a free sample, so if you think that introduces bias to my review, but as I mention always, I get sent most things as free review samples, so they're pretty much on an even footing. I've had this sword for a while. It's taken me a while to get around to this dedicated review. I have previously done a first impressions review of this sword and another Darksword Armory sword, but this is a dedicated one just for this sword. Now, first up, this is a relatively new product to their line. Darksword Armory are based in Canada, and it should be noted that their swords use components across different models. So you will find, for example, the pommel or the blade on different swords as well. So you can find different combinations, obviously linked below to their website. Now, I'm going to dispense with the scabbard relatively quickly, other than to say, I have spoken about these in the past, they are well made. They are wood cord scabbards with good quality leather over the top. They come with an attached belt and a steel chape. And really to say that this scabbard doesn't necessarily go in time period, if we're being historically accurate with this sword. This is an earlier type of suspension system that we'd normally find in the 12th, 13th, early 14th century, and really this is a 15th century, say mid to late 15th century style of sword, and so these scabbards, or rather this belt attachment system, would have been phased out by that time. But nevertheless, it's very nice to get a scabbard, and they are well made, they are good quality. They help protect the blade and they help protect you because it is a sharp blade. Now, first of all, we will talk about the blade. It is a very attractive blade with a hollow grind, as you can hopefully see in the light reflecting on this blade. So it has essentially a midrib, and then the flats, or the primary edge bevels, are scooped out. That's called hollow grinding, and what that does is it reduces mass from the blade without reducing rigidity. So actually, for what's really quite a light blade, it is quite a stiff blade. Now, in terms of the mass, what are we talking about here? Well, actually, I just weighed this, and it's a shade under 900 grams. It's about 895 grams, which is pretty light. It's not super ridiculous light. It's about the same weight as, for example, a 19th century infantry officer's sword, but nevertheless, it is relatively light for medieval era swords. But moreover, it feels crazy incredible light. Now, I can't fully explain why that is, but it does have distal taper. It's got a good mass distribution on it, and I think because of that, 900 grams is not a lot of mass, and when you have a pommel on a thing of a medieval type pommel, and you have distal taper, as this does have, and you have a hollow ground blade, it means that of that 900 grams, a relatively large amount of that mass is down towards your hand. So this thing moves incredibly quickly and responsively. Also, it's not an incredibly long blade. Just grab my tape measure here. So it is relatively short, but not crazy short. It's 26.5 inches, which is around 67 centimeters. Now, a lot of you might think that that sounds quite short, but actually that's not particularly unusually short for medieval swords. We tend towards preferring longer swords these days because we're on average slightly taller than they were, and we've maybe got a different context of use for these swords. But actually there is quite a lot of medieval arming swords that are in that range, although it is slightly on the shorter end of the spectrum. There are shorter ones of this, there's 24, 25 inch blades. But at 26.5 inches, this is somewhat akin to the Westminster Abbey sword, sometimes known as the Henry V sword, in terms of size and proportions. Now, when you've got a relatively light mass, and you've got the distal taper, and you've got the mass concentrated towards the hand, and you don't have an especially long blade, that is, therefore the inertia is not that far from your hand, it gives the feeling of an incredibly quick and nimble sword that you could certainly employ very effectively in a tight spot, either in armour or out of armour. And indeed, yes, absolutely, you could use this with a shield or a buckler, or even a second sword or a dagger or something else in your left hand. So this would be quite compatible with using with something else at the same time as well, or indeed on horseback as well. So it is a nimble, light sword, and that is the overwhelming feeling you get about it in your hand. Now, just to talk about the blade in a little bit more detail here, let's have a little look at touch sharpness, finish, and flex, and also distal taper. So first off, let's start with some stats. Let's look at the distal taper, because that defines a lot of characteristics about this blade, about the way it feels. So at the base of the blade, or as close as I can get to it with this particular crossguard fitted, it is 6.5 millimeters. If I move up about 30 centimeters up the blade, it is 5.5 millimeters. If I move about 60 centimeters up the blade, it's 3.7 millimeters, and then up just before, let's say, about 3 centimeters from the tip, it's down to 2.8 centimeters. So it has significant distal taper, and this is obviously represented when you flex the sword. I'm being relatively careful here, of course, because this is a sharp blade, and you can see that it stays absolutely stiff and straight in the first half of the blade, or at least almost visually, and all of the flex is in the second half of the blade, which is great. That's really what you want from this type of sword that's a multi-purpose cut and thrust sword. It's not completely dedicated for armor penetration or anything like that, where you might get less distal taper. So absolutely good distal taper, and that gives us this very good feeling in the hand. Now, in terms of fit and finish, the midrib is pretty straight. It's got a little bit of a wobble to it, but it's pretty damn straight. Looking up the blade, up the fullers, there is quite a lot of rippling, okay? So it's not perfectly flat, like you might find on some higher end swords or some custom swords, and it has got a fair amount of rippling in the polish. Now that is accentuated to some extent by the mirror polish, and the mirror polish is very nicely done, I have to say, and I do sometimes criticize higher end swords that only have a fairly rough satin polish on them. I understand in the modern world some people prefer a satin polish to a mirror polish, but there we go. Historically, I think a mirror polish would have been regarded as more work and therefore higher status. But it does have quite a lot of rippling up the blade. It's not the flattest and smoothest in the world. In terms of the edge, it feels very fine to the touch, and it has a micro secondary bevel. So it has been brought to a very thin edge geometry, and then a very small secondary bevel has been applied to give it the final sharpening. Now, I can just about run my fingers up the blade, but it's fairly sharp. I can feel it starting to bite, and therefore I would regard this as a good sword sharpness. I wouldn't criticize the sharpness on this blade at all. So edge geometry good, distal taper good, sharpness pretty good. You can probably make it, well, you can definitely make it better. The tip is very nice and pointy. So overall, I really like the blade of this sword. Now let's look at the hilt. So it must be said that the hilt is not the most historical in the world, but it is historically inspired, and overall, in overall silhouette, it very much fits, I would say, in the middle of the 15th century through to the end of the 15th century, so 1450 to 1500-ish, in overall outline. No real criticisms about the wheel pommel. It has a little bit of a cast look, I think by virtue of being very, very shiny. But that being said, I can see that the recesses in the centre have been lathed, because I can see the circular nature of the removal of the material there. So I wonder if it's partially cast and partially lathed. It might be entirely lathed, but I don't think so. I think it's probably cast, which is, you know, it's no bad thing. In terms of the peening at the end, it's rather tidily done. You can see there, it is peened at the end, peened construction, so obviously through tang. Now the grip is very, very nice, and it is comparable, very much comparable with more expensive swords than this in the mass production market, but also in the custom market. It has thin leather over wood. It has risers at top and bottom, and it has an imprint of the cord that was wrapped around when it was glued. Now the grip is very, very nice, and I would also point out, if we look at the seam, leather seam down here, The leather has been very well thinned and it is nice and straight. So this is a very, very tidy grip. In terms of the shape, this is a shape that we see appearing even on one-handed swords. So if you elongated this, you'd think of this as a hand and a half or bastard sword, longsword grip. But you do see one-handed versions of this indeed, particularly in the late 15th, even through into the 16th century. So it is of its time, and I actually really like, it's got a hexagonal, 1, 2, 3, yes, hexagonal cross section, which gives a, you can see it's got a midrib down here, and then it's got flats essentially up either side. So it's got a hexagonal cross section which gives fantastic edge alignment. You're never going to be confused about indexing that edge. Fantastic edge alignment, and I rather like this swell in the middle. It's actually quite similar, funnily enough, to some Indian tulwar hilts, and it feels nice in the hand. Some people might find that the hand wants to slide down a bit, but with a sword that this is this light and this well balanced, I don't think it's an issue. And even if it does, you've got a wheel pommel to stop your hand going anywhere at the bottom there anyway. You'll notice in terms of the grip length, you've got about 2 fingers of length beyond, and I've got relatively large, I would wear large, size large gloves, for example. You've got about 1 finger or 2 fingers extra width at the end there, which is kind of normal for this period, having a little bit of extra length. Could you hold this two-handed? Well, indeed, you could just about squeeze a second hand on here. Would you want to? Not really. I don't really see a purpose why you'd want to, unless you're really small, possibly. It could be a longsword for a really small person. But by and large, this is very, very light and nimble, and I can't really imagine why you'd want to put a second hand on there, but you physically could do it. Only one minor criticism, and this might really bug some people and it might completely not bother other people. If we look at the pommel here, you'll see that there is a step between the width of the grip and the width of the pommel. Now, I personally think that looks a bit sloppy, and it is indicative of the fact that this pommel was made separately to this grip and that guard and that blade, and then they were married up. And I don't think that this pommel was made with this grip in mind. I personally would prefer to have seen this grip beveled down so that it met the width or thickness of the pommel a little bit more flushly, because I think that shoulder is a bit unsightly, and you should never really be able to see the wood core of a grip as you can do here. You probably can't see in this light, but basically you've got a little ledge here which doesn't really look right, and it doesn't look like this pommel suits this grip or this grip suits this pommel. They don't marry up very well. That being said, at the other end, the grip marries up to the crossguard very, very well in terms of width. Now, in terms of that crossguard, this is without a shadow of a doubt, and I did mention this before, my least favourite aspect of this sword. In its overall shape, it's fine, but there are 2 things that I really don't like about it. Okay, first of all is the detailing in the centre here. This kind of Art Deco-like line design, which obviously is the same on the other side. Now, when you combine that with the very shiny finish of this guard, maybe if it was satin it would look a bit better, but I find that particularly ugly and out of character for swords of this period. So the whole rest of the sword absolutely looks late 15th century. That bit does not. So that's the main thing I don't like. The second thing to mention is that we have a recess in the guard here for the blade, but it's a very big hole. It's a much bigger hole than is made for this blade, and again I think that's indicative of the fact that these parts, these components, are made separately and then married up and then put onto different models of sword. And if I look down into that recess, I can see what appears to be, oh no, that's just some cord actually. It is just sitting down against the base of the blade. I thought there was a leather washer in there, but there isn't. So whilst it is tight and it is solid, having that big gap around the blade means that you can't really clean down there, and there is likely to get moisture and dirt and things down there that you can't get out very easily except with a toothpick or blade or something. And ideally that should sit flush against the blade and be the same shape as the blade, whereas you can see that it is not, hopefully you can see, it is not really the same shape as the blade, and we've got a big gap around it. So overall, I really like this sword, but I'm not a fan of the guard, and I'm not a fan of the way that the pommel marries up to the grip. That's a fairly minor thing, but the guard for me is a bigger thing. That said, it's still a really attractive sword, and it feels absolutely fantastic in the hand, I have to say, and it's got great distal taper, great edge geometry. So I'm a massive fan of the blade, a massive fan of the grip, a bit meh about the pommel, and don't really like the guard. But overall, it is a really nice sword, and the blade being the most important thing in terms of the solid construction and everything else. There's no vibrations, nothing appears loose. In terms of the blade, it is fantastic, really, really nice. So I'm going to do a little bit of cutting with this and see how it goes, and then we'll report back. So I hope that was useful for you. It was useful for me, actually, quite illuminating. So the basic issue with getting through the water bottles was that this sword's not really quite sharp enough. It has really good edge geometry, but the edges just aren't quite finished. They don't have quite enough bite to them. So you'll notice that when I power through with a downwards cut, it goes through most of the bottle and then tears the last bit. When I try and come over with an upwards cut, it's just not really, doesn't really have the sharpness to get through there. Especially, I have to say, and there's user error involved here as well to some degree, in that because it's a fairly short blade, I am striking quite far up near the tip. It's possible that if I'd impacted way down nearer the hand, I may have gone through it with those rising cuts. But as it was, striking up here, which frankly in a fight is mostly where you're going to be hitting with anyway, it's just not, as you can see, I can run my fingers over it. It wasn't really quite sharp enough to do it. So, having said that, I am always in my reviews very keen to impress upon you that that is just an issue of the final polish of the sharpening. And the fact is, a sword can be a fantastic, the best sword in the world, and if it's not sharpened to that fine degree at the end, it's not going to go easily through water bottles. It's just a question of finishing there, okay? And a lot of sword manufacturers are making good swords. Now, that just don't quite have that final edge of sharpness, even top-end makers. So, in terms of the wood striking, that is really an abusive test, I have to point out, but actually it chopped really well into wood. Now, edge sharpness, as you'll know from a wood cutting axe or a machete, you can cut through wood with the right edge bevel and the right type of mass distribution. You don't need a fine edge to cut through wood. And actually, this chopped into the wood really well, and was really solid, and it has not picked up any wobbles, any vibrations, anything at all. There's no bends or deflections or any kind of damage to the blade. There's no, nicks or anything like that, which you'd hope there wouldn't be from wood. But it stood up to the wood really, really well. And obviously I hit it for a little bit longer than you saw on screen there. So in terms of build quality, I'm impressed. There's no damage to the hilt. There's no bending at the tang, there's no bending in the blade, there's no vibrations, no looseness. The guard hasn't come loose, and there's no movement there at all. So it stood up really, really well. So I hope this is a useful review. The basic upshot is I really like this sword. It stood up well to the test. It needs sharpening better, and I don't really like the guard design, but make of that what you will. In terms of the build quality and the distal taper and the edge geometry, I think it's a really good sword. So check out the link below. Obviously, you'll get to the Darksword Armory website there, and you can see a load of other models, some of which may share this same blade but have different hilt components. So go and check that out. I hope this has been useful. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon back on the channel. Cheers, folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.